just a really brief explanation of what I discovered. When I buy a vehicle, it doesn't take me long to sometimes open up an unwanted can of worms. Okay, so this is all back together. I had this apart, took the little clip off, took the nut out, and when I first bought this motorhome, drove it down from Edmonton, and then immediately the first thing I noticed was I was going through almost a traumatic amount of gas. Like just to barely touch the gas pedal and just to drive the thing. Or actually for the first month I did actually put it through its paces. I was tromping on it, flooring it, racing it, and really getting the feel of the vehicle. Now, typically in any old vehicle, this is a 1979, and this is the biggest one I've bought so far. It's still a 1-ton, but it's the biggest one. It's a 23-foot. I think it's got like it's probably got about 130-inch wheelbase, I think, just from axle to axle, basically from front to back, right? And then the overall length is 23 foot, and but this one's not. It's not a 3-ton. It's not a 5-ton. It doesn't have. It's only got 16-inch wheels. But really simple. Now, this is the 12 o'clock. That's the 12 o'clock mark on the steering shaft, which is where I got it now, right? And then I also aligned the steering wheel. Now, when I first bought this thing, wasn't until I took the horn cover off, and then I took this nut off. I took this lock ring off, took the nut off, and where the steering wheel is kind of at that, this is 11 o'clock, right? Just a little off this. Here's your 12 o'clock, right? Here it is at 11, right? That was how I was driving it. It was always, I'd be driving along, and I would just give this part of the wheel here, just while just normal cruising. This part, I always had to keep this kind of back here, kind of right there at about 10, 11 o'clock-ish, right? That's just traveling in a straight line in any traffic. Don't matter if I'm 30 miles an hour on a city street, or if I'm going 70 miles an hour on the highway. This was the usual straight line travel with the steering wheel, right? See where the steering wheel is now. The nut was off. I had this off. This is while I was parked. This wasn't. And this 12 o'clock line was back here at the 8 o'clock. Maybe so right down here. It was off by 90 degrees. It was way down here. Is where that 12 o'clock mark was. And then at first I was looking at that going, that's quite a bit off. And then I knew that the toe alignment was slightly off, because all of a sudden where I looked on the driver's side, they had actually installed a brand new outer tie rod, which thankfully was a Moog part. Like, they paid the extra for the more expensive tie rod end. Thank God. And they didn't thread it in to the correct amount of thread count. So when you have an inner outer tie rod on an adjusting sleeve, what you do, right, it don't matter if you've already taken apart the old tie rod or not, or you go to put the new one in, but as you count the threads as you're putting the new one in, what we used to do is we'd take the old one, we'd take the old tie rod, leave it on the bench or on the floor right next to the vehicle, and then you get your new tie rod out of the box. And what you do is you put the two side by side to look at the threads. And then also to count, or also just to measure the approximate length, right? Whether it's in, like millimeters or inches, of where the outer tie rod, where the pin that goes into the spindle part on the front end, the amount of distance to the adjusting sleeve. That's all it is. You're not measuring the full length of the tie rod. Don't worry about the inner threads so much, right? But what you do is you take that measurement just of the outer threads on the adjusting sleeve to the end part of the tie rod, And what you do is you basically try to make the inner and outer tie rod on the adjusting sleeve as equal as possible, just within 1 or 2 threads of each other. So anyways, on this one, so the outer tie rod was out by nearly an inch, and it had approximately, we'll say 25 or 30 threads coming off just the one side. And on the inner tie rod, which wasn't adjusted, it was still tight on the adjusting sleeve and everything, the inner tie rod only had, we'll say, about maybe 9 or 10 threads showing on the inner tie rod. So the outer one was off by almost an inch. And all I did was I loosened off that adjusting sleeve, removed the tie rod end, the outer tie rod end, just off the spindle, like just popped it off. And luckily, like after putting oil on it and getting things loosened up, everything turned nicely on that left side. And so what I did was I initially set it to factory, right? So I eyeballed where the threads were coming off on the inner tie rod and then equaled it out, threaded in the outer tie rod to the right amount of turns to where I had both the same amount of threads coming off the inner and outer tie rod from the adjusting sleeve. Afterwards, I didn't tighten it. I just threw it all back together, and the front end alignment was slightly off. Had to kick the toe in on the left wheel quite a bit to get that part to line up. And there was a couple of other things that I was doing. So, but like I said before, so this 12 o'clock mark, which is also the, like you can see here, the mark here, this is all now, finally, this is all dialed in correctly. The steering wheel and the shaft are now, this is where they're supposed to be. And I don't know, I can come off with a whole bunch of racial type slurs about mechanics, or like, I mean, there's various types. You got black mechanics, East Indian mechanics, Asian mechanics, and then you got your regular, your normal Canadian, American, Caucasian, whatever, like all these different guys. And the way I looked at this, somebody fucking turbaned it. Oh yeah, I'll bet you if I went up to Edmonton and tracked down the alignment shop that fucking did this absolute fuckery of an alignment job, I'll bet you they fucking turbaned it. I'll bet you they niggered it. They totally fucked it. Anyways, and the reason I'm so angry about that is because it's eating the 2 front tires. It's eating the inner tread on both front tires. And I was just absolutely, I don't know what you call it, but $30 fucking dollars an hour in fucking gas. And yet everywhere I've gone for years, everyone says, oh, 454s are really good on gas if you're gentle. Just gentle, just drive it nice. Don't race it too much, just drive it gentle. They're great on gas. And I'll admit, I had 1 month where I went from close to $400 or $500 in fuel 1 month down to just $50 fuel cost the following month, because I simply changed that one part of my driving habit where I laid off the gas pedal a little bit. Also keep the engine really gently tuned, so it's not souped up for performance or any real high output. This thing's gentle. And this motorhome breaks every posted speed limit on any street, highway, you name it. This thing gets noticed, or it can. And then I got another part on order that will change the transmission to a 6-speed, which will bring my engine RPM down by nearly 80%. And it'll really improve on my gas mileage. So all this just to play with this front end part, get the toe in at least somewhat correct, even if it's not quite 100% correct. It sometimes will take me anywhere from 2-3 tries right up to even up to 10 tries just to make those little tiny, very incremental adjustments on the inner outer tie rods to finally get this thing to point in a straight line. Now, this has not been road tested. I played around with all this yesterday underneath the motorhome and up top, and I really cranked this. Like I said, this whole thing was way off this way. This whole thing was way off, just to make this thing travel in a straight line. Now, my expectation of where I got this all set now, oh, she's gonna pull to the right slightly. I got a feeling now, just on the first test, like I said, haven't even tested it or nothing. I'm guessing right there, that's my straight line right there at the moment. If not, maybe right there, that's about 11 o'clock, right? 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock ish, right? And the reason was I haven't been able to make the proper adjustments on the passenger side, on the right, for the right tie rod. And the reason for it is because everything's still stuck and frozen. It's rusted together and what have you. And yeah, put a little bit of oil in there, tap it with a hammer or heat it with a torch just a little bit, and eventually it'll come loose and I'll be able to make those adjustments on the passenger side. There's also a drag link. So the actual, like, the steering shaft goes down through and attaches to the steering gear. The steering gear is attached right at the very front of the frame, right behind the bumper. And then there's a drag link that's like a foot long that goes from the steering gear to another linkage. And that controls all the steering on this side. And then the rest of it all links over towards the passenger side after that, typical GM. And it's got that independent front suspension, the upper lower, I think, wishbones or whatever they call that. But anyways, it's always been a nice, comfortable ride. Sometimes they tend to float, tiny bit of float or wander in the steering. And all I do when I initially set up my front end alignment is just to get it so everything just a slight pull to the right, so it always wants to go just slightly towards the curb, mainly with the crown of the road and stuff like that. And yeah, once I get this thing road tested a little bit and the odd highway test, what I do is I'll just keep watching. I just keep watching for the tread wear on the front tires, and then once I know I'm not eating the front tires apart anymore, then I'm pretty satisfied with that. Another way I can tell too was I'll be able to notice how very, very little throttle I'll have to use to drive this thing. So if I find that I'm still using a little too much gas, or it's just running a little underpowered, or if it's making the motor work a little harder than normal, then I'll just keep playing with that toe in just a little bit more, or a slight toe out. So right now, this left side is towed out a little bit further than I want. I had to tow it out because when I dialed this front end in, it was towed in too far. Like, both front wheels were way off. And then what I did was I approximately eyed in where I got the passenger tire almost perfectly straight, and then had to make all the adjustments initially just off this left side because the left side was loose enough to make the adjustments. And that's just all I did. Just did that. And that's not the first time I've done that. I've done this several times. And then eventually, once it's all done, I have the option. I could go pay an alignment shop to fix it for me. But the problem is with alignment shops is a lot of times the minute they find that little bit of clunk or play, they're going to want to price that part and then bill me for it, right? And so they'll charge me more than the part's worth plus the labor, and I don't need that. I can replace that part myself at cost. I don't pay retail for that part, and then put it in myself. I got all my own tools for that shit. So, but I mean, for a 1979, and this thing's been driven a lot. This thing's got a lot of miles on it. It's been through the United States through its younger years. It was purchased out of the United States, I think. And yeah, that's my typical front end story on these old vehicles. So yeah. Anyways, thanks for watching.